Now, I'm not sure how old I was when I first became acquainted with one of these four-wheeled chariots. But at some point, I went from being a toddler to one who could actually be accommodated by this front row seat that's up here. If you remember, you sit up here. I'm not going to demonstrate this for y'all. So I need you to use your imaginations. But there is a seat here with a nice little slanted backrest, and your legs hang out here and dangle, to and fro. I see how kids hang on these things now, and some of them, like this one, this is a fancy model. This even has a seat belt. I survived childhood because mine didn't have a seat belt. But from that perspective, as a child, sitting in the grocery cart there, you can imagine looking this way. There was a reason for that, because when Mom was grocery shopping, she had an advantage as to what was ahead. She could see the things rather than the child sitting there with all the I wants wanting to kick in as you see the things at eye level. But at some point, this seat got just a little too small for me. Maybe for you, we found ourselves having to push this dredged cloud that we became chained to through our markets, through our stores, through the places in which we are held captive in the midst of our commodities, chained to this beast of burden, so that we too might be accommodated in our lives, discovering more and more how we are held captive by the environment in which we reside, namely the market economy. This week is Thanksgiving week. I was talking with the choir before we came out and how in the life of the Christian calendar, this is the end of the Christian calendar. This is Christ the King Sunday, day in which all of those Sundays after Pentecost finally come to a culmination, and we realize the significance of Christ as someone who has a significant dominion in our lives. It's used with that kind of hierarchical language as a king, a monarch. God is Lord in our lives, is what we come and gather on this last Sunday of the calendar year. You could say today is New Year's Eve because next week marks the new year within the Christian calendar. And what greater way to experience that moment as we launch into Advent, that season in itself that reminds us of a coming. The coming of the birth of Christ in us. So happy New Year's Eve. Maybe next week we can wish each other a Happy New Year at that. But in the space of New Year's Eve and New Year's is this week in which we are now embarking upon, called Thanksgiving Week. We're thankful for many things. Each week I'm thankful as I stand up here before you and have a chance to not only be your leader, but to walk alongside with you within the challenges, the celebrations, the joys, the hurts. We get to walk together in life, things in which we are called to be thankful for. And so, although it seems like this week we come to the table of feasting, or maybe just the table of a sandwich, depending upon our situations, we're reminded then of our economy that surrounds us, whether it be weak or whether it be strong. And then at the same time, we keep hearing the mantra, it's time to start getting stuff. Get something for those whom you love. Better yet, get something for you because you deserve it. And so it seems like this event called Black Friday isn't just now the day after Thanksgiving. It's an event that began sometime around October, I believe. Or was it after Easter? I'm not sure, but it just seems we're constantly reminded to know that life's no longer these events that mark a transition from one season to the next. It's a constant continuum, a stream of really unconsciousness, because we are held numb to the market that surrounds us. Again, we become so engrossed within the burden that is now pulling us along, rather than we guiding the resources that we have available to us. So as we come to the Thanksgiving table, or when we come to these moments, we come to a situation in which we want to put on our best. We want to impress everybody. We want to have the best prize, the best turkey, the best looking table setting. We want to put on our best even if we're a guest at somebody's table. We go out and find us a new sweater vest, or a nice dress, or a blouse. Something to take to the family, maybe a case of $3 Chuck, or maybe just a bottle of Dom Perignon. Perhaps we bring the marshmallow casserole, or the ones with the crunchy onions on top, as a way of saying thank you. We want to put on our best. I'm reminded when I was living in Virginia and attending seminary that I was invited to my boss's house for Thanksgiving. I was working in a church as a youth director, and this was a weird, ironic dichotomy here because my boss happened to be the father of one of my professors in seminary. Now, I thought I could be the most, for lack of better words, cocky student that year because I thought, hey, I can get off in a breeze here. I'm working for the guy's dad. I ought to be able to ace this class. The class was systematic theology, and when it comes to being a minister, you would think theology is probably something we should have a grasp of. I learned about humility that semester. I don't know if it was because I had eyes for the girl that was sitting next to me in class, or that I thought I could look at her rather than the professor and the board that was in front of us, but Dr. Solon Jr. reminded me that my theology was a little askew and that maybe I should pay better attraction to what he had to say rather than the gift of God that was sitting next to me. So it was a very humbling Thanksgiving. I had to sit at the Thanksgiving table not only with my professor, but also with my boss, who was the pastor of the local church in which I was serving in. Now, when you move from the wonderful climates of Mexican food and barbecue of the Southwest and go to someplace like Virginia, you're exposed to different things. Baked ham, Virginia peanuts. And they had, I swear they must have been from Texas, but I was in Virginia, these huge, big purple grapes sitting on the table there. Now, I wanted to be a good guest. I wanted to put on my best, and I wanted to partake in everything. So I had some of the ham, I had some of the peanuts. I was going to have one of those big, huge grapes. This thing was huge. It was almost the size of an avocado pit. I put it in my mouth, and I took a big bite, and I once realized that that was not a grape I put in my mouth. And it was that day on Thanksgiving that I was introduced to a Greek olive. I know some of you probably love Greek olives. I like feta cheese, and I like a little Caesar dressing on my lettuce. But this Greek olive in my mouth just took me somewhere where I did not want to go. I wasn't at the Rennick family table, here in Mesa where I could just spit the thing out of my mouth. I had to commit and I had to eat that thing. So I chewed it and I chewed it. And I smiled and I smiled. And it finally went down. Which leads us to be reminded that we sometimes try to put our best when we realize it might lead us to a moment to discover what's best for us. Over the past couple of weeks, we've talked about consumer consumption and mass production and what's happening there in the economy, and then we opened up the Bible, we began kind of looking and saying, hey, this isn't anything new. You see, when it comes to the experiences of the Israelites, they too have moved from a period of freedom to captivity, to an element of consumption, to even more mass production in their own selves, to finally an element of shared community. All of this then leads us to ask the question of how we can live in a society in a time of consumer captivity, all in this attempt to find a sense of freedom for ourselves in a world of prosperity, while on the grounds within our own conditions. namely in the midst of the exploitation of the almighty dollar. And who doesn't like to stretch what they earn? Which in turn then can lead us away from community and away from one another as we start serving the beast, or the market, or the dollar. Therefore, we're called to live in a community with one another in a life that's transformed as God's people, to live within the sense of abundance that is sufficient for us. We began by talking about Pharaoh, how he wanted to build up this kingdom, and on the backs of the Egyptians there, it became a season of mass production. That upon the backs of the slaves, he would continue to build more and more and more. But God heard their cries, their prayers, and delivered them to what we know as the Promised Land. But it's there in the Promised Land that it seems like life began to change a little bit. It started to look good. It was easy to reflect on the past. Well, things were pretty good back then. Moses, don't you remember? There was there was manna in every pot. There was at least some water to drink. And then Moses reminds them, "And the lashes upon your back and the deaths of our ancestors." And so, as Bob began to harp upon last week, Moses takes a little trip up to Mount Sinai, not to build a hospital. That's an insider joke. But he goes up there and he receives what we perceive as the Ten Commandments. These are laws or rules that God wants us to live by. But I think more so, they were a list of ways how we can live in community. It wasn't about this judging God that would say, don't kill, don't steal, don't covet from your neighbor, honor your parents. These were things that God was laying forth through Moses to the new community as they were delivered from a post-consumerist slavery element of Pharaoh by saying, when you live in freedom together, you care for one another. You don't take from one another. You appreciate what your neighbor has. You honor family. You honor God. Now, Bob started to talk a little bit about them from Paul's letter to the Romans. And in talking about the letters of the Romans, we realize that the transition seems to kind of go in a full circle here. We now are no longer under the control of Pharaoh, but now we have Caesar, who is the one in charge. He's the one cracking the whip. He's the one on the coins in whom we have to pay honor and to whom we have to worship. But then comes another deliverance. And that's through the path of Jesus, in which Paul writes about, and in that he says that we are not to let our minds be conformed to this world, but to be transformed into a new way. Which comes down to today's theme, better living. I lift up the Psalm 50 for you today, because it captures what the worshiping community was doing back in the Hebrew Bible. Psalm 50 captures really the Sunday in which the people would gather and offer up their gifts to God. It was Stewardship Sunday as we read this passage. And in that we hear of what God wants. And what really God is saying is, you can't outgive me. In one of the passages there, what am I doing here? He says, I don't want your blue ribbon bowl. Another translation says, I don't want your bowl. It means basically, I don't want your bowl, the way we know it. You can try to impress me with all you have and lay it before me on the altar. Go ahead and cut the necks of the goats and have a glass of it while you're at it. It ain't going to impress me, because I have it already. And if we were to continue reading into this chapter, into the verses 16 to the end, we begin to see what the selfishness leads us to, even to the point in which God says, you give your mouth free rein over evil. And again, we are reminded what that word evil means. It's basically to be an adversary to getting in the way of God's stuff and moving forward. So as we live within the joys and the gratitude of God, as we realize that we can't outgive God, but we can give God who we are. We hear then the Lord say, "Those who bring thanksgiving as their sacrifice honor me. To those who go the right way, I will show the salvation of God." It's a passage that calls us to make a decision, or at least it was calling the community of faith at that time. It's one, you can either turn to a life of greed, distract yourself to the consumption of the day, or you can live a life of gratitude toward God, a life of generosity, of being thankful for what the things God has given to you, to us as a community, rather than thinking what we can give to God. It's about second chances. And we only have to go a few verses or a few chapters in the book of the Bible itself to realize that, we're meeting a God in this book that's about giving people second chances. Whether it be Adam and Eve, Moses, the story of the Israelites, Jeremiah, Job, Ruth, Esther. Let's jump to the New Testament, these disciples who are given a second chance. To those who suffer from illnesses, disease, and afflictions that are given a second chance in life, we serve a God of second chances. We serve a God of generosity that is always giving gracefully to us. So we're to present our bodies as a living sacrifice that's holy and acceptable to God. That is our worship. So what does it mean to live gracefully in a Walmart world as we come to a conclusion this morning? And I know the Rennick family album is no different than your album. Every Thanksgiving isn't perfect. It isn't the smell of cinnamon in the air or pumpkin pies baking. It isn't the smell of the chicken or mixing the gravy together. It's not just the game on the TV or the parade or the post-dinner nap that happens. Sometimes Thanksgiving is hard. Sometimes it's tough. It might leave us in a moment where we don't feel really thankful at all. I remember some 25 years ago, Mom had back surgery, one of her first, and she was over at Chris Ridge Convalescent Home in Phoenix. And it was Thanksgiving. And so, how do you be thankful when someone's in a care center or in a hospital? I barbecued some chicken, made some green beans, put some of those crunchy onion things on top of it. I'll give you the recipe after church if you want. And I took it over to Chris Ridge Convalescent Center, and we had Thanksgiving. And we made Thanksgiving that moment in that place, in a little convalescent room. The family album even seems to continue on a little bit more in the sense of joy that tomorrow marks, I believe it's the 12th or 13th anniversary of my adoption of Phil. A Thanksgiving time to be joyful and happy, to go from a life of despair to a life of goodness. We pat ourselves on the back that we're feeding 300 kids tomorrow. That's 300 kids that don't have a home. May God use us faithfully to be instruments of hope, of light, joy, of thanksgiving in a space like our fellowship hall where Thanksgiving will take place. Last Thanksgiving, I was with my youngest son in rehab, celebrating Thanksgiving with him. A time when we would think that this isn't fair or right, but no, within the couple hours of time that we had together, we played Monopoly. We ate some cake. We drank some soda pop. We had a bag of Doritos. You're allowed to bring a whole lot of other healthy things in there. And that was our Thanksgiving. Family was captured in that moment. In the midst of life in which we could have thought it was despairing, something that could have been a hold of us, but we decided to let out of that. I've shared with you that when I was married, my wife left the week of Thanksgiving, and how Thanksgiving dinner was spent with a a large-size blizzard with ice cream and bits of Butterfinger in there, making Thanksgiving what it would be. The holidays are a wonderful and joyful time, a reminder of God's graceful giving in our lives. But it sometimes can be the biggest kick in the keister that can catch us by surprise when we realize that what do I not have to be thankful for, and how do I live better in the meantime? You see, how will we live and put the shopping cart behind us, that instead of putting stuff into it, we start to receive out of God's cart of abundance in our lives? Modern-day theologian Walter Brueggemann calls this a second life. When we display gratitude, we express that we are dependent upon God's good gifts by dying to the old things that has held us captive in a land without promises and hope. And so we live in this day and age in which we are called to this second chance, this second life, a time to look back, to move forward into the steps of Christ, who calls us to live and to do those things that we would even imagine that we could do. It's to live in a way of generous gratitude, of graceful giving. And so our challenge for us today is this: to take a second chance. To step forward into God's grace rather than hanging out all of our lives in the position of the back seat here, not seeing what's ahead of us and being conflicted by what's behind us. We are to hear God's voice say to us, "Thank you for your faithfulness," and welcome into a life of limitless thanks. Let the people say, Amen. Amen.